And today, Catherine's going to be talking to us about climate, coronavirus, and our health. So thank you all so much for tuning in. Catherine, you're still muted.
Yes, I just unmuted myself. I muted everybody else. Okay, so welcome everybody to our very first virtual Science by the Glass. It is BYOB, beverages optional, and we are going to be talking about the topic of the day, which is our health, the coronavirus pandemic, and how that relates to climate change, or does it? What I want to do is just get out of the way the fact that climate change did not cause the pandemic. You might have read that on a website somewhere, but it is not true. So does that mean that there aren't any connections? No, there absolutely are connections, and that's what we're going to dig into today. So I know there's still a few people joining. We have great turnout. So far there's, I think, 63 of us here, which is fantastic. And I'm going to be using Poll Everywhere to talk with you too. So just a second here, let me share my screen. So if you haven't already, what you want to do is on your computer or on your phone, either one works, you can go to pollev.com/TexasTech, or just pollev.com and enter Texas Tech. If you ever need this address again, you're going to see it in the chat window. Mackenzie has posted it there. So go to pollev.com/TexasTech, and I'm going to ask you the first question. Here we go. I know that we are virtual, and so my question is, where are you tuning in from? Click on this map to share with us where you are. You don't have to be too precise. If you're anywhere around Lubbock, we'll assume that you're somewhere there. But so far, it looks like we've got 2 from Texas and 1 in Minnesota, which is fantastic. Oh, California. Excellent. If you're not in the United States, that's totally fine. Just click off the map in the direction that you're in. So if you are in, there we go, if you're in New Zealand or Japan, or if you're in Europe or Africa, go ahead and, or the Caribbean, it looks like we got somebody in the Caribbean or South America, go ahead and click off the map in the direction that you're from. All right, this is great. So normally we do Science by the Glass in person at our beloved local pub called The Local. But because we're doing it online, a lot more people are able to attend, which is fantastic. Okay, so that was the easy question. Now I have a slightly harder question for you, and you will see why I'm asking this question in a few minutes. The second question I have for you is this. If you could describe yourself in one word, what would it be? If you have to cheat and use 2 words, make sure you join your 2 words with a dot, okay? So if you identify as a cat mother, then you want to say cat.mother. But otherwise use 1 word, and it can be any word. There is no limit on the words other than a language filter. All right, we've got a lot of educators. We've got a scientist, I love the emotional words, enthusiastic, optimistic, pessimistic, yes. What people are, meteorologist, ecologist, student, artist. Oh, we've got a couple of artists. So the bigger the word, the more people are answering this question. Oh, the scientists are starting to win out, but we do have a tornado lover, a pastor, and a software engineer, as well as people who are both reserved and enthusiastic, optimistic and curious, practical. Do we have anybody who's the opposite of practical yet? I'm not seeing that, but hopefully there are some people there too. I love this. Okay. Great. And I get to save these, and we can share these. And also this is being recorded. It will be posted on our YouTube channel, so you will be able to access this afterwards as well. All right. So when it comes to climate change, we're going to start with climate change, and then we're going to segue into our health and the coronavirus pandemic. When it comes to climate change, the first most dangerous myth that the largest number of us have bought into is that we have to be a certain type of person to care about the planet. And if we aren't, then we don't care. I don't know if you know, but we've just passed the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And Earth Day is generally seen as something that environmentalists care about. So I was curious, I went to Google and I looked for the definition of environmentalist on Google, and here's what I got. A person who is concerned with or advocates for the protection of the environment. And Google offers you some words to go with this, and they said it's similar to conservationist, preservationist, ecologist, green, or nature lover. Okay. And then I looked at the second row of words. Eco-activist, eco-nut, eco-freak, tree hugger. Oh no. So then I looked for photos of environmentalists. If you put in environmentalist and you look for photos, here's what you get. What does this suggest an environmentalist is? Well, first of all, it suggests that environmentalists are predominantly what? White, 100%. It suggests that they are predominantly male, all but one of them. It suggests that they are more than likely to be dead. 6 out of these are dead. And apparently there's bonus points if you have a really impressive beard. Now, I know that we're in the quarantine, and I know that barbers and hair salons have been closed. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you this question. And here I just want you to pick a letter. Pick A, B, C, or D. At this point, my hair is normal. Why are you even asking? Getting a bit shaggy. I would qualify as an environmentalist according to those photos, or you would give Rapunzel some stiff competition. Of course, that being the fairy tale about the woman who grew her hair so long that it went all the way out the window. All right, all the normal people, you must have some expert hairdressers in your family. You are very fortunate. Second is getting a bit shaggy, and only 5% of us, even after 2 months of quarantine, would qualify as an environmentalist according to Google. All right. Just a second here. So here's the thing. We all live on this planet. And this planet supplies everything that we use. It supplies all of our air that we breathe, the water we drink, the food that we eat, the materials we use to make everything. The computer or the phone that you're on, the chair that you're sitting in, the house that you're in or apartment or building, everything comes from this earth. We can't just float around in outer space, and the economy can't certainly float around outer space without the resources of this planet. And so the truth is, to care about the health of our home, and calling it our home, I think, makes it a bit different. To care about the health of our home, we only have to be one thing, and that's a human who lives here on this planet. So my definition of an environmentalist is not what you find on Google. I would simply say an environmentalist is a human who lives on planet Earth. Because if we live on this planet, we have every reason to care about the health of our planet, no matter who we are. And in fact, who we are, our unique self, makes us the perfect person to care. Whether we are a parent, whether we love the outdoors, whether we love animals, whether we study it as a scientist, whoever we are, we're the perfect person to care. So I want to ask you a slightly different question now. And the slightly different question is this. If you had to say why you care about climate change, I care about climate change because I am, what would you say? It might be the same word as you already put. It might be a different word. But everybody has a word that they can put here, whether it's something as basic as being a human. I see that one rising to the front. Whether it's what we do, we study this planet as scientists. Whether it's the fact that we are a parent or a grandparent or a child or a member of a family. Whether it's the fact that we care about water or food or resources for people. Who we are is already the perfect person to care. Oh, I like all of these that are coming in here. Still alive. That's a really good one. If you are still alive, then you care. I love that. That's really good. I've never seen that one before. All right. The bottom line is we all want a better future if we think it matters to us. So, how does climate change affect our health? Let's start to connect the dots now. Climate change affects our health in at least 8 different ways. Yes, 8. And only the first one is extreme heat. Now, extreme heat is increasing. There was a brand new study that just came out last week that showed that by the end of the century, if we don't seriously reduce our carbon emissions, 1/3 of the entire world would live in places where the heat is insupportable for the human body. So extreme heat does matter, but today we already see impacts in many different ways. So high temperatures make air pollution worse. Climate change is making our weather disasters more frequent in some cases or more severe in others, and that affects our health. As heavy rainfall increases, it's increasing the risk of water contamination and waterborne disease. We also know that as temperatures change, the range of what we call vector-borne diseases is expanding. Now, coronavirus is not a vector-borne disease. Coronavirus is carried by who? By us. That's why we're all practicing physical distancing, although we're socially connecting, and wearing masks. The only reason I'm not wearing a mask is because I'm the only person here. But climate change is increasing the risk of other types of diseases that are carried by carriers, like what? Like mosquitoes and ticks and rats and more. Those are spreading northward as the planet warms. We also know that as CO2 levels increase, it decreases the nutritional content of our food. The food grows faster, but it has the same amount of nutrition in it. So you might get a bigger, eggplant or squash, but it's only gotten the nutrition of a much smaller vegetable or fruit. All of this affects our mental health, and perhaps arguably the most severe impact is the fact that it's increasing resource scarcity, which increases conflict, which increases the chances that even basic services, vaccinations, giving birth, being able to get access to antibiotics, even what we take for granted may fall by the wayside in times and places of conflict and political instability. The second most dangerous myth that we've bought into, the first being that I'm not that type of person, the second most dangerous myth is that issues like habitat loss, biodiversity loss, deforestation, pollution, and climate change, what do these have in common? They're all caused by humans, are distant issues. They only affect future generations and people or places who live far away. Well, anybody who thought that, if they think that today, they have been living under a rock. First of all, because we know that climate change is affecting us in the places where we live. But even as recently as last year, when you look at the Yale public opinion maps, if you see me speak before, you might have seen these maps because I think they're so clear in showing what we really think. You can click on these maps and you can go to whatever county you live in, anywhere in the US, they have them for Canada too. You can click on any congressional district in the US and any riding in Canada, and you can get people's opinion on about 30 different questions. So when you ask people, is global warming happening? Most people say, yes, it's orange. But then you say, well, will it harm plants and animals? Most people say, sure, yes. Will it harm future generations? Yeah, I think it will. What about people in developing countries? Probably. It's a little lighter blue, but it's probably. What about people in the United States? A little bit more blue here. We think it'll affect animals and people in the future, but not people here. And then, do you think it will affect you personally? Almost everybody says no. This is a big problem because people could say, I totally agree with the science, but if I don't think it matters to me, why should we do anything to fix it? We think it only matters to animals like the polar bear or to people who live far away from us. The truth, though, is that our impact on the health of the planet is already affecting our health here and now. Johan Rockström created something called Planetary Boundaries a number of years ago, and it shows how we are pushing the boundaries of our planet in multiple ways. Climate change is right there at the top. You can see it right there from 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock. But one of the ways that we're pushing the boundaries most is actually through biospheric integrity. You see that? What does that mean? The integrity of our biosphere. In mid-March, the irony is unmistakable. In mid-March, WWF Italia, so the Italian WWF, released this report. And as you know, Italy was one of the countries hardest hit by the pandemic. The report was called The Loss of Nature and the Rise of Pandemics. And in the report, it said the chance of viruses passing from animals to humans, it's a process known as zoonosis, and that is how we got coronavirus. It passed from animals to humans. may be increased by the destruction of natural ecosystems and the uncontrolled trade in wild species. So conserving and maintaining nature, a biosphere, and the benefits it provides is essential for preserving our health and our well-being. They released this just this March. Talk about prescient. They go on and they have this really nice little infographic here where it talks about how deforestation reduces habitat and also contributes to climate change. Collecting and trafficking in species puts species in closer contact with humans. Animal markets also does the same. And all of this increases the risk of zoonosis, the chance that humans will come into closer contact with animal populations. Climate change isn't on this figure, but it should be, because climate change also changes habitat. Animals can't live in a certain place anymore. It alters the food available to animals, forcing them sometimes to come into closer contact with human populations to get food when there's a lack of availability. So climate change is, as the military calls it, a threat multiplier that interacts with and exacerbates the bad choices we're making in other areas to increase the risk even of something like zoonosis happening. We know that fossil fuel extraction affects our health. The practice of cutting the tops off mountains in the Appalachians to get the coal out of them. As my friend Marianne Hitt writes here, mountaintop removal coal mining is poisoning the waters in Appalachia. It's allowing toxic heavy metals to leach into local water supplies where people live, and residents in those areas have higher incidence of cancer, heart disease, kidney disease, birth defects, and more. Fossil fuel use is a health issue. We all know what oil spills look like and the devastating impact that they can have on ecosystems, for example, in the Gulf or in the Arctic. But in places like the Niger Delta, where these occur much more frequently with hardly any effort to clean them up, they're affecting human health directly too. In fact, the number of research studies looking at the impact of oil and gas spills in the Niger Delta on human health, particularly that of infants, the unborn, children, and mothers, is so extensive that it has its own Wikipedia entry. And then there's deforestation, there's the air pollution resulting from combustion of fossil fuels. All of these are health issues. And air pollution is perhaps what you might call the silent killer. It's responsible for almost 9 million deaths per year. Why aren't we talking more about that? Perhaps because it's been with us for so long and somehow we view it as an acceptable price to pay. Compounding the effect is the fact that people who live in poor neighborhoods right here in North America, as well as the poorest in every area around the world, are disproportionately affected by the water pollution and by the air pollution from burning fossil fuels. So how does this connect back to the pandemic? Well, it turns out that if you have already been exposed to air pollution and poor air quality over a long period of time, you are much more vulnerable to coronavirus. And they found this with SARS as well almost 20 years ago. In fact, people who had SARS back in 2003 were twice as likely to die from SARS if they contracted it, if they lived in polluted areas versus if they didn't. And who lives in the most polluted areas? Generally, it's the people who can't afford to live anywhere else. It explains why, for example, 30% of the population of Chicago is African American, yet 60% of the deaths have been African American. Because just as climate change exacerbates the existing challenges of socioeconomic equality and poverty and lack of access to basic healthcare and resources, the coronavirus pandemic does too. And that's why I would argue that the planet's health is our health. But you might say, hang on a second. I've seen headlines like this: blue skies around the world, especially in some of the most polluted areas. And I've heard that carbon emissions are dropping, and indeed they are. This is an excellent analysis from a website called Carbon Brief. I highly recommend Carbon Brief for its scientific analyses in very readable terms. And they said, well, what impact will the pandemic have on atmospheric carbon dioxide? The slightly positive news is that according to satellite images of air pollution, the nasty stuff that we breathe in, that it is going down. Originally in China, then in Italy, and then now in North America, satellites have tracked massive decreases in air pollution. And in fact, the decreases are so massive that some scientists estimate, in particular a study that came out of Stanford a couple of weeks ago, some scientists are estimating that in very polluted areas, as many or more lives have been saved due to air pollution reductions as have been lost to the pandemic. That's not to say it's a silver lining. Any life lost prematurely is a tragedy. But again, the issue here is we don't talk or think much about air pollution, even though it kills 200,000 people in the United States every year and almost 9 million around the world. So that is the slightly positive news. But now let's look at the bad news. The bad news, according to Carbon Brief, this is from that article, is that average CO2 levels in the atmosphere are still going to increase, even though emissions are going down. And I would add that any emission reductions we do see right now are going to be short-lived because they've been achieved by unsustainable actions, shutting down the economy, throwing people out of work, taking kids out of school. Not only that, but a lot of the recovery packages could actually divert attention and resources from clean energy and climate action to propping up fossil fuel-based industries. So if you know me, you know I do a lot on Twitter. I wrote a Twitter thread about it. And don't worry, you don't have to be on Twitter. I'm going to walk you through it. And if you have questions, we're going to be taking questions at the end in about 10 minutes. So save your questions. I'm going to be collecting them via poll everywhere. But let me take you through this to really unpack what's happening to carbon emissions due to the pandemic. And if you're wondering what carbon emissions are, they are emissions from burning coal and gas and oil, from deforestation, and also some from agriculture as well. And they are responsible primarily for climate change. So in the Twitter thread, I said, as the economic slowdown due to the pandemic shutters industry, air pollution and carbon emissions are dropping. So a lot of people have asked, what does this mean for carbon emissions? Here's a short explainer. First of all, these are atmospheric carbon levels measured at the Mauna Loa Observatory, which is a clean air site. So it's just getting the background emissions. And people have sent this graph to me many times, probably a dozen people, and they said, look at the end of it, it's not going down. Shouldn't it be going down if our carbon emissions have been decreasing? No, it shouldn't, because the carbon in the atmosphere, first of all, over short periods of time, is controlled by the variability in the carbon coming out and going back into the biosphere. If you look back here for a second, you see how there's this like pattern? What is that pattern? That pattern is the Earth breathing, you might call it to be poetic. What it is technically is that pattern is when the biosphere, the vegetation in the northern hemisphere, which has more land area, so in the northern hemisphere, spring and summer, the biosphere springs into action, interacting with absorbing and emitting carbon dioxide. And then in winter, it shuts down. So that variability you're seeing is due to massive exchanges of carbon with the biosphere. Every year, vegetation and land exchange more than 400 tons of CO2, whereas we humans produce about, this is a bit out of date, about 35. So short term, it's mostly governed by the biosphere. But here's the other thing. Our carbon emissions have been increasing year by year by year. And what atmospheric carbon responds to is not what happens in a given year. It responds to the cumulative emissions, all of it. It's kind of like if you smoke a cigarette today, you don't get lung cancer. It's smoking a cigarette over years and decades that increases your risk of lung cancer. Another way to think about this is this image. We have been putting a brick on this pile every month since the dawn of the industrial era. And year by year, the brick we put on this pile has been getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So for 1 month, the brick that we put on the pile was about 25% smaller. And we expect there to be a difference in the size of the pile? No, you couldn't even hardly see that if one brick was 25% smaller. That's why we don't see an impact on our total carbon in the atmosphere, and we don't see an impact on climate change. So another way to think of it is a bathtub. Let me explain this. The bathtub is the atmosphere. The level of water in the bathtub is the CO2 level in the atmosphere. The faucet are human emissions, and the drain is the natural processes that remove carbon from the atmosphere, like the biosphere, trees, the ocean. So what we humans have been doing is we've been turning up the faucet every month, up and up and up and up and up. So just because we turned it up 25% less, we're still turning it up. That's why we don't see a big impact on the water in the bathtub. What do we have to do? First of all, we have to stop turning it up. Then we have to actually turn it down, right? And then we have to turn it off, and then we have to make the drain bigger to take more of the carbon out of the atmosphere. That's what we have to do. And then, don't worry, we're hitting rock bottom here. We're going to go up after this. Rock bottom is this. As the pandemic passes, carbon emissions are going to bounce right back up again, and possibly then some, because industry is going to do its best to make up for lost time and lost income, lost productivity, and lost wages. So at this point, you may say, Catherine, I thought you were an optimistic person, but this is not looking so good. Well, I'm a realist, moderately so, and so we have to realize how bad the problem is before we can head up in the other direction. So where am I going to go from here? Does this mean it's hopeless? If even shutting down the entire economy across the whole world, taking children out of school, most people not being able to go to work, massive drops in economic productivity, if even such draconian measures are insufficient to impact climate change in any meaningful way, how do we have any chance of fixing it long term? No, it does not mean it's hopeless. In fact, exactly the opposite, and here's why. Ready? The pandemic is not going to reduce carbon emissions long term because the reductions weren't achieved through sustainable changes in human behavior. Taking kids out of school, shutting down the economy, throwing people out of work, the government issuing stimulus checks, that is not sustainable behavior. We can't sustain it long term. So what are sustainable solutions? Sustainable solutions consist of using our energy more efficiently, so we produce less carbon for the amount of energy we use, replacing our sources of energy with clean sources that don't produce heat-trapping gases, altering our behavior so that we don't need as much energy, and increasing the drain on the bathtub, how much carbon we pull out of the atmosphere and put into the soil where it's good, into the biosphere, into crops, into trees. Let me just give you a couple of amazing highlights here. Highlight number one. Did you know that according to a report from just last September, the US could cut its carbon emissions in half through efficiency improvements only? Now, we're not just talking about light bulbs and electric cars. We're also talking about industry. We're talking about rescheduling transportation. There's a lot of details that go into this. But saving energy saves money, it saves carbon, and it could actually get us halfway to zero. That's kind of crazy. We know here in Texas, we are #1 in wind in the United States. When I first moved to Texas, we weren't even in the top 10 in solar. We are now #4 in the country in solar and moving up. So watch out, Arizona and California. Texas is on its way. We know that the land area required to supply electricity through clean energy sources is about equivalent to the land area currently used for maple syrup or golf courses. Yes, maple syrup you can see there in upstate New York, and golf courses you can see down there in South Carolina. We know that in Alaska, they're getting energy from the rivers, hydrokinetic energy. We know that in Canada, 60% of our electricity is actually hydro. In fact, we call our power bill the hydro bill because of that. We know that there's geothermal power, there's biomass power, there's even brand new types of nuclear power that are more affordable and safer than traditional nuclear. We know that it's been 6 years since fossil fuels lost the race against renewables. Yes, 2014 was the year where more renewables were being installed around the world than fossil fuels. And as of last year, the number is at 72%. 72% renewables, 28% fossil fuels. That's pretty good news. I love that it's happening in unexpected places and ways. Places that you wouldn't normally think about, including right here in Texas, of course, but also including places in the world that don't have fossil fuel resources, that don't have access to electricity currently. Project Drawdown is a fantastic resource. If you are not already familiar with it, please bookmark it. Actually, Mackenzie, if you could put drawdown.org in the chat box there so people could click on it. It has over 100 amazing solutions that will, some of them you'll be like, oh yeah, of course, I thought of that one. But then some of them you'll say, oh, bioplastics, coastal wetland restoration, conservation agriculture, tell me more. If you're looking for hopeful, positive, sustainable solutions, go to Project Drawdown. And here's the bottom line, ready? Temporarily, the pandemic reduced our emissions in some of the biggest emitters in the world, the US and China, reduced our emissions by 20 to 25% in just a few weeks. Now, again, they're not sustained, they're going to bounce right back up again, but 20 to 25% in just a few weeks. How much do we have to reduce our emissions to meet the Paris target? Well, to meet a 1.5 degree target, we have to reduce our emissions about 40% by 2030 and 100% by about 2050 or 2060. 40% by 2030, we were halfway there in 4 weeks. We were halfway to our Paris target in 4 weeks. So actually, this is incredibly hopeful. If the changes we saw today were permanent, we'd be halfway to the Paris target in 4 weeks. I mean, that is just mind-blowing. The fact that when we put our minds to it, we can achieve far more than we ever imagined. If that is not hopeful, I don't know what is. So the bottom line is this: climate change is a threat multiplier. It takes the issues we're already worried about and what more than our health and makes them worse. Climate action is action for the health of the planet and the health of the human race, because we live on this planet, it's our home. And the biggest lesson I think we've all learned from the coronavirus pandemic is this: when it all comes down to it, no matter who we are, no matter where we live, no matter what country we're from, no matter what language we speak, no matter where we fall on the political spectrum, when it all comes down to it, we all care about the same things: the health and the safety of our families, our friends, our loved ones, our communities, our countries. That is what the pandemic threatens, and that is exactly what climate change does too. And that's why who you are is already the perfect person to care about climate change, because all we have to be is a human living on this planet. And when we talk to other people about climate change, that's why it's so important to explain why it matters to every single one of us. It is not a distant issue. It is not a future issue. It is not an issue that only matters to people who are white, male, likely dead with large beards. It matters to every single one of us on this planet. The coronavirus pandemic matters to us, and climate change does too. So to close, I want to offer you this image, which I think is the best metaphor for climate change I've ever seen. It's not the polar bear on the melting iceberg. Who's on the melting iceberg? We are. We are the ones on the iceberg when it comes to a changing climate. And that's why it matters.